It was a device that completely changed the course of history. A technological Pearl Harbor. The Cold War's 9/11. On October the 4th, 1957, a Soviet satellite known as Sputnik is launched from an intercontinental ballistic missile into outer space. With its successful orbiting, the United States mainland is now vulnerable to attack. Communist neanderthals have fired the first shot in the space race.
This country, which was supposed to be so backward, jumps ahead of us. They launched the first satellite into space, and they launched one Sputnik after another. They are ahead of us. They launched the first satellite, they launched the first animals, little dogs and rats into space, and then they have the first manned space mission. The Russians are ahead of us. They're grabbing the space on the front page of the newspapers, and we look bad, and America gets scared.
The cities of Detroit, St. Louis, and Pittsburgh, once considered untouchable, can now be obliterated by missiles bearing the Red Star.
Lincoln had said once that the United States would always be secure because there were two oceans to protect us. All of a sudden, this thing goes over, and there's no more. The oceans don't matter anymore. This is up there.
And Sputnik is massive. The launching of this satellite, really affects the Americans tremendously because they're no longer at the cutting edge of technology.
From coast to coast, Americans go into a state of panic, fearing the end is near. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, Russians celebrate their victory over the United States. With Sputnik, the Soviet Union will no longer play second fiddle to Yankee imperialism. And having the first satellite in space, world opinion shifts dramatically, with Moscow now viewed as the new leader in Cold War weaponry. But in the 5 decades after Sputnik's launch, declassified information released by both superpowers sheds a much different light on this earth-shattering event. What was thought to be communism's great technological triumph instead turns out to be a huge gamble that miraculously paid off. A project viewed not as a priority, but as a mere afterthought. A satellite seen as having little value in the fight against America. Now see a much different perspective of this chapter in Cold War history. Take a behind-the-scenes look from the other side of the Iron Curtain and judge for yourself the real story of Sputnik. In 1953, with the death of Joseph Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, an ill-educated farmer from humble beginnings, becomes first secretary of the Communist Party, giving him almost complete control of the Soviet Union. With his rise to power, a dramatic departure from his predecessor's policies takes place. Under Khrushchev, a program known as de-Stalinization is continued, signaling a change in how one of the most brutal regimes responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people is going to operate. Prisoners inside the gulags are released. Crimes committed in the name of communism are acknowledged by the government. A new corner is being turned in Russian history. But what is seen as an act of kindness on Khrushchev's part is interpreted around the Eastern Bloc as a sign of weakness. Soon after this shift in policy, riots against puppet governments occur in Georgia, Poland, and most notably in the nation of Hungary, where in 1956, Soviet tanks are needed to battle demonstrators on the streets, resulting in thousands of deaths.
Anti-Russian hatred, smoldering for a decade, erupts without warning. The flames of liberty and revenge against tyranny leap high. A 16-year-old girl risks her life to remove the despised symbol of Russian enslavement. Throughout the city, Soviet war memorials come crashing down. Budapest is in revolt. With uncontrolled fury, crowds set fire to Russian flags and put Soviet books to the torch. The Red Star is sent tumbling into the gutter.
Across the world, people begin to see cracks in the hammer and sickle. And economically, this superpower is in dire straits. After years of centralized planning, smaller and smaller returns are sent back to Moscow. Yields in grain production during Khrushchev's first year in power fall to 1913 levels. And after more than a decade of struggle, the Russian people demand a higher standard of living after sacrificing through the Great Patriotic War. Major economic reforms are desperately needed, not only to satisfy the wants at home, but also to continue the fight against the United States, as it too enters a new era.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help you God. So help me God.
Across the oceans, Khrushchev grows weary as a Republican president is sworn into office. In 1953, Dwight David Eisenhower, the famous and beloved Second World War general, becomes commander-in-chief, ending 20 years of democratic rule inside the White House. With the party of Lincoln back in power, seen by the Kremlin as staunchly anti-communist, Ike's victory sends a strong signal to Moscow as the Cold War substantially heats up.
The military will tell you that as of today, they cannot stop a successful Russian attack.
That can be corroborated rather dramatically, and we didn't plan it this way, Governor, but the floor manager has just handed me a bulletin saying, quoting Pravda, as saying that the Russians have just exploded a hydrogen bomb. Now, as a final question, and this, we might say a loaded one, very quickly, with that information, could you tell us in about 3 words what we should do with that in mind?
I should say that we should step up our civil defense program, and we should, of course, step up our military defense program.
During the first years of the Eisenhower administration, nuclear weapons production is dramatically increased, where by 1955, America possesses over 2,000 atomic and thermonuclear bombs, an amount 20 times greater than the Soviets.
Thermonuclear weapons, which were a step up from the atomic bomb that had been used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The thermonuclear bomb used an atomic bomb as its trigger. So we're talking about an order of magnitude larger. It was also a period in which there was great concern of annihilation. There were people were building fallout shelters. The government was pumping huge amounts of money into shelters in people's basements.
And despite claims of a bomber gap by Democratic politicians, billions are spent on long-range aircraft. Nearly 400 B-47 Stratojets carry a nuclear payload at all times, waiting for the orders to attack.
And you remember, in those days, we were flying a lot of times with nuclear weapons. There was none of this hysteria about having nuclear weapons. Not only were bombers flying around with them, fighters were flying around with nuclear-armed missiles. So the country was unaware of the importance of the thing.
Under the command of Curtis LeMay, Soviet airspace is penetrated on numerous occasions by the Strategic Air Command as U.S. planes fly over the polar region. With bases in Greenland, Germany, Turkey, Britain, Japan, South Korea, Pakistan, and Alaska, American bombers can easily reach Mother Russia to deliver a deadly first strike.
By 1954, when I was flying, we had plenty of nuclear bombs. We had plenty of B-47s to deliver them, along with B-36s. And we had no doubt that we could stop the Russians in their tracks. They might start a war, but the army would have found its country destroyed behind it.
In comparison, the Soviet Union has no such bases. Nor can it compete with the United States in terms of aircraft production, as the new B-52 Stratofortress is rolled out for the first time, possessing 8 jet engines, a 45,000-foot ceiling, and a range of 7,000 miles. This gigantic new bomber, capable of carrying thermonuclear weapons on board, has those in top circles of communist power frightened. In contrast, the Soviet Tupolev 95 is plagued with numerous problems during the early 1950s.
There are famous stories of them parading there was some super bomber, and the CIA would realize that they would take the same super bomber and parade it around Red Square during May Day. The same mocked up bomber several times would look like they had dozens of them, and then in fact they had one mocked up thing.
While engineers improved the aircraft known to NATO as the Bear, America and its neighbor to the north, the Dominion of Canada, spent $500 million to create a string of 63 radar bases along the Arctic Circle, known as the DO Line. With its creation, Russian bombers can now be tracked if they decide to cross the pole, giving Washington enough time to scramble its jets, allowing pilots to shoot down any Soviet plane that dares to enter North American airspace, eliminating the element of surprise. Adding insult to injury, a new top-secret high-altitude aircraft known as the U-2 begins flying over Russia at 70,000 feet, taking reconnaissance photographs of important military installations. Authorized by Eisenhower and the CIA, the intelligence collected by this aircraft proves invaluable.
It's a way of committing and, maybe influencing things around the world without committing troops. And this is important, especially in the wake of Korea. But the primary issue is to maintain a technological advantage that the United States has. Eisenhower was all about R&D. He understood that America's power was best spent where its advantage was, which was technologically. The Soviets couldn't equal that as readily as they could put men into the field. And in that sense, the U-2 program was a sort of natural extension of American technological superiority.
And with no Soviet plane capable of shooting down the U-2, Khrushchev grows red in the face with embarrassment as his airspace is repeatedly penetrated by the enemy.
We had U-2 flights going overhead. We were working on spy satellites at that time. They were actually starting to work on them through a thing called Project Corona, a project that was so secret. There was never any paperwork with it. All meetings were held in open-air parking lots. There were things we were doing to develop a certain satellite for spying.
This harsh reality leaves the Soviet dictator with an important decision to make. Having a dreadful economy, incapable of competing with the United States, a new superweapon is sought out. A weapon that is cost-effective while capable of rendering a fatal blow. And by 1956, this superweapon comes in the form of an intercontinental ballistic missile. In the small town of Podlipki, Sergei Korolev, a scientist who has spent years in Stalin's gulags, shows the Russian dictator a model of his new design. A multi-stage ICBM towering at over 100 feet, dubbed the R-7. Containing 5 giant boosters generating 1 million pounds of lift, its range is at over 5,000 miles. Twice the weight of the Hindenburg when completed, the R-7 will be 4 times faster than the original German V-2 rocket, capable of striking the United States mainland at 24,000 feet per second. No aircraft or warning system can stop this doomsday weapon from annihilating the land of the free. Khrushchev becomes enthralled with this ICBM and the threat it represents. Feeling all the money and resources America has poured into aircraft production will be obsolete against the R-7. In the end, Soviet quality will win over American quantity. For this reason, the enthusiastic Russian leader immediately approves all funding for the missile's development. Seizing the opportunity, Korolev shows Khrushchev and others his second and most prized creation. It is a 184-pound satellite, 23 inches in diameter, made of aluminium, magnesium, and titanium, capable of leaving the Earth's atmosphere and entering space, a dream he and his fellow scientists have envisioned since their youth. His target audience is not impressed, seeing little to no value in having satellites in space. With America being such an open society, where military procurements are endlessly debated in the halls of Congress, where roadmaps of major cities, documents that will be highly classified in the Soviet Union, are sold in gas stations across the United States, there is little need to spy on their adversary. What they need is a weapon to destroy their adversary. Fortunately for Korolev, funding for Sputnik is approved only after Khrushchev is assured that it will not interfere with production of the R-7. Little do they know that it is Sputnik that will put Soviet technology on the map, setting off an unparalleled rivalry between the two superpowers. But while Moscow thinks the ICBM will propel them ahead of the United States, in the quiet southern town of Huntsville, Alabama, located near the Tennessee River, America is hard at work developing its own plan for space exploration. At the headquarters of the American Ballistic Missile Agency, the famous German scientist Wernher von Braun and his ex-Nazi associates work on a missile called Redstone.
Von Braun was the most important rocket engineer and space advocate of the 20th century. That others originated the idea of the feasibility of space travel, like Obert and Goddard and Tsiolkovsky, but von Braun was the first one to build a ballistic missile. The V-2 was a revolutionary breakthrough that led to American and British and French ballistic missile development, or certainly strongly influenced it. And he also, in the United States, then became a major advocate for the feasibility of space travel.
Being the architect of the infamous V-2, shortly after the Third Reich surrenders, von Braun arrives in El Paso, Texas, where he and his fellow scientists are relegated to a career of obscurity for the next 5 years, assisting the U.S. military in launching captured German rockets at the nearby White Sands missile range.
Nazi Germany's prize secret, the deadly V-2 rocket bomb, is assembled by U.S. engineers for testing. Rivaling the atom bomb in importance, the 46 feet of death and destruction is set in place by an ingenious elevating boom at White Sands Proving Ground near Las Cruces, New Mexico. Parts to make up 100 V-2s were brought from Germany, and Proving Ground officers are carrying on experiments involving war and peace uses.
1945, the United States was interested in bringing Germans in. I mean, particularly the V weapons in the last months of the war, the jet fighter, was fascinating to American and Soviet and French and British, officers and industrialists and scientific specialists. And they said, we got to use this German technology. That project was originally called Overcast, then was renamed Paperclip in 1946 and became a program for long-term use of the Germans. Also, increasingly, as the Cold War heated up, then it became a program to keep German scientists and engineers away from the Soviets.
Two men, however, would change this German visionary's life forever. The first is Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, whose warnings about the communist threat to America are confirmed as the Soviet Union successfully detonates the atomic bomb, followed by the fall of China in 1949. The second man is Kim Il-sung, whose troops crossed the 38th parallel in 1950, leading to a bloody 3-year stalemate on the Korean Peninsula between Western democracies, led by the United States and the communist powers of Pyongyang, Beijing, and Moscow. With the threat of communist expansion greater than ever, the El Paso team is sent to Huntsville to develop the Redstone, an evolution of the V-2 and a weapon that hopefully gives America the edge in any future conflict it faces. For von Braun, he hopes an added benefit of this project is the ability to explore outer space, a goal both he and Korolev share. Working alongside a team of brilliant scientists, the evolution of this missile, called Jupiter, is further developed under the guise of von Braun and General John Medeiros, the head of ABMA. Unfortunately for Huntsville, President Eisenhower does not share their enthusiasm. Despite spending enormous sums of money on various military projects, Ike draws the line when it comes to missiles, fearing it will lead to another arms race, compromising his domestic agenda that includes the building of a vast interstate highway system.
As president, he was trying to keep a lid on military expansion, to keep a lid on the military expenses. He had a traditional Republican, conservative fiscal policy, to eliminate deficits, keep the budget down. And he found that that was a great struggle that he was basically losing mostly to the armed services, to the industry, to the military-industrial complex that wanted more weapons, more missile systems. And he saw von Braun running around advocating building more rockets, more missiles, more spacecraft, expanding our space program, and became very annoyed with him.
In 1955, spending on rockets consumes just 1% of the military's overall budget. In response to Ike's fiscal restraint, numerous congressional Democrats speak of a missile gap existing between America and the Soviets, a charge that puts Eisenhower in a difficult situation.
Dwight Eisenhower faces a problem in how to respond to the missile gap allegations. He can't reveal what our U-2 planes, or even that we have a U-2 program for quite a while, is discovering about the Soviet missile program. So he can't fully say, this is what we know, these are our overflights, this is what they've got. Because if he does that, he tells the Russians what our intelligence program is, and that's something you never do.
Assisting the president's critics, von Braun takes his case to the American public by writing a series of articles and by appearing on the new medium of television.
He became a star in 1952 with a series of articles in Collier's magazine, which then led to collaboration with Disney and Disney television programs in the 50s. Space travel had not yet happened, but seemed like it was on the verge of reality. And people were beginning to think of it not as a Buck Rogers joke, but as something that could actually come about.
The Russians build all the missiles that they're capable of building. And if we build all the missiles that we're planning to build, then quite obviously the Soviet Union will enjoy an advantage in the missile area. I would go under the assumption that they will build all they can. I'm quite aware of what we are planning to build. I therefore think that the President, however expert he may be, has come to the wrong conclusion on the needs of defense.
While rocket spending increases as Eisenhower bows down to domestic pressure, von Braun receives bad news when the Navy is awarded the contract to develop Project Vanguard, the first American satellite scheduled to go into space, leaving the ABMA in the dark. In the Soviet Union, Korolev and his team of scientists do not have to worry about balanced budgets or rising deficits. Their only mission is to get the R-7 up and running, no matter what the cost. Khrushchev, in placing all of his eggs in one missile basket, cuts spending to all the other services, a move that infuriates his generals. If this ICBM doesn't work, Korolev's career and possibly his life will be in jeopardy. A key problem during test flights is the missile's nose cone. Traveling at 24,000 feet per second, when the missile re-enters the Earth's atmosphere, the intense heat causes the warhead to disintegrate, making this superweapon useless. By March of 1957, the test launch deadline has come and gone. A dark cloud now hangs over Sergei Korolev, who seems unable to carry through on his promise of having a fully functioning ICBM operational, despite all the blood, sweat and tears he and his fellow scientists have poured into the project. What is needed now is a distraction, something that can buy some time while the problems with the R-7's nose cone are sorted out. And in looking for the perfect diversion, Korolev turns to his most cherished creation, Sputnik. When Harry Truman is asked whether the Soviets will ever detonate a nuclear weapon, the president responds, never. When they do in 1949, Truman remarks, German scientists in Russia did it. Probably something like that. In America, the Soviet Union, despite their revolutionary MiG-15 swept-wing fighter, is seen as a backward society, incapable of competing with the United States on something so complex as sending satellites into space.
We looked upon them as morons. The big joke of the time was the Russians could never build a suitcase bomb because they didn't have the technology to build a suitcase.
If Sputnik succeeds, Khrushchev will have an important propaganda victory over his arrogant enemies. For this reason, the launch is given the green light for October of 1957, saving Korolev's career and altering the course of history forever. In order to make sure Sputnik is an undeniable victory for communism, Korolev orders the ball to be unprecedentedly shiny, while making sure it transmits a distinct beeping sound, so that it can be heard on ham radios from New York to Tokyo. Seeing is believing, and for this satellite to be successful, the Western world needs to experience it firsthand. On the other side of the globe, the American people's attention is directed not at any Soviet missile or weapons system, but on Little Rock Central High School, as Arkansas Governor Orville Phobos orders the National Guard to halt black students from enrolling. This event consumes Eisenhower, who reluctantly orders the 101st Airborne to protect the Little Rock Nine.
The very basis of our individual rights and freedoms rests upon the certainty that the President and the executive branch of government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decisions of the federal courts, even when necessary, with all the means at the President's command.
With the city under siege, America's focus is on this crisis and not on its Cold War rival, where in Kazakhstan, Sputnik is about to be launched. On October the 4th, 1957, what is later called the space race begins, when the R-7 propels Sputnik into a realm unknown to man, circling the Earth at a speed of 18,000 miles per hour.
Sputnik goes up on October 4th, 1957. It's the off night of the World Series, the only World Series in which Mickey Mantle and Hank Aaron play against each other. It's sort of a normal night, a Friday night in America. And this thing goes up, and it is stunning. It is the papers, for the first couple hours, the papers are thrilled. And all of a sudden I had the NBC network on, and the guy said, "Listen now for the sound that will forevermore separate the old from the new." And he plays this beep, beep, beep.
As a result of intensive work by research institutes and designing bureaus, the first artificial Earth satellite in the world has now been created. This first satellite was today successfully launched in the USSR.
Sputnik is massive. The launching of this satellite, really affects the Americans tremendously because they're no longer at the cutting edge of technology.
Men and women from around the world rush outside to see what they think is the world's first satellite, hovering above them. People begin listening incessantly to the sounds generated from this aluminium ball for 22 days straight. Newspapers from Cairo, Egypt, to Los Angeles, California, publish story after story about this mysterious new device. Television and radio stations across the United States report on this Soviet triumph.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here, an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished. A three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite. One of the great scientific feats of the age.
An earthbound America believes that with Sputnik, bombs and missiles can now be fired at them from above. For the next month, fear begins to set in as the backward Russians jump ahead, having not only the first satellite, but also the first intercontinental ballistic missile.
And the Russians would say, they'd go on radio at Moscow and they'd say, "Tonight, the Sputnik vehicle will pass over Little Rock, Arkansas." And even though it wasn't going to pass over Little Rock, they were using this. And the whole world is looking at us and they're saying, "Well, wait a second, you got to send your top military in to get these little kids into school, and the Russians are now looking at a bright new future, looking at this new world up there. So part of it was our own embarrassment. Part of it was our own realizing where we were.
Eisenhower, already suffering in the polls from his handling of the Little Rock crisis, gets caught flat-footed by the news of Sputnik. But instead of offering leadership, the former general downplays the device's significance, a gesture that does not go over well with a frightened American public.
Vanguard, for the reasons indicated, has not had equal priority with that accorded our ballistic missile work. Speed of progress in the satellite project cannot be taken as an index of our progress in ballistic missile work. Our satellite program has never been conducted as a race with other nations. Rather, it has been carefully scheduled as part of the scientific work of the International Geophysical Year.
What the president cannot reveal, however, is that with this breakthrough, a precedent has been set, clearing the way for the United States to launch its own version of Sputnik to spy on the Soviets. Back in Huntsville, von Braun is livid, knowing that his Jupiter C rocket could have easily put a satellite in space an entire year before Sputnik. Oddly enough, having worked for a totalitarian regime himself, he is not surprised, knowing that the Soviet Union would eventually achieve orbital flight, something many American politicians on both sides of the aisle scoffed at. Just like Nazi Germany, communism, with a combination of discipline, patience, and an endless sum of money, could excel against Western democracy in terms of scientific achievement. In the Kremlin, Khrushchev joyously celebrates the significance of Sputnik. The R-7 ICBM, a weapon that he and his advisors thought would galvanize the globe, has now been overshadowed, something no one in Moscow could contemplate only a month before. As the world listens to the constant beeps emitted from space, it is the Soviet Union who has the upper hand.
You get this notion that the Russians are working in very dedicated fashion to improving their technological capabilities, which wasn't wasn't a lie. It's still not what the Americans have in terms of technological threshold, but that doesn't really matter in the late 50s. The fact that the Russians are catching up and in some ways potentially exceeding the United States is where the political implications, the perception, comes in, and that was of extreme importance.
Unfortunately for Eisenhower, perception is reality. Across the globe, while people see images of American oppression on the streets of Little Rock, they read stories of communist triumph in the uncharted realm of outer space. The United States, once viewed as the leader in Cold War weaponry, is dethroned as public opinion moves in favor of Khrushchev. With this dramatic shift in the balance of power, the Soviet space program, once a mere pipe dream to men like Sergei Korolev, now becomes priority number one. What is needed is a follow-up act. Meeting with Korolev, the Soviet leader decides that for the 40th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, a dog will be sent into outer space, a goal scientists are unsure they can accomplish. Miraculously, a dog named Laika, placed on board Sputnik 2, soars above the Earth's atmosphere on November the 3rd, 1957, marking a new first in a space race that the Soviets are dominating in.
Laika, first space traveler, was ready for the takeoff, and here it is. 600 miles, the half-ton satellite joined the meteors in outer space to orbit around the Earth at 18,000 miles an hour with its passenger.
This feeling is amplified when the Navy's 3.5-pound Vanguard satellite, launched from a rocket bearing the same name, crashes for the entire world to see, humiliating America in the eyes of the world.
The Vanguard satellite operations in the United States, I think they're 2 months later in December. They're spectacular failures. And all of a sudden there are jokes in the press. They nickname the Vanguard the Kaputnik and the Failnik. and things like this after Sputnik, it becomes sort of a, in some degree a tongue-in-cheek joke, but in many ways a kind of, cutting slice at American technological superiority having failed. So I think, again, we need to remember in the late 50s that was a serious and substantial blow to American confidence.
Needing a solution fast, Washington turns to von Braun and his Huntsville team, who promise their own version of Vanguard to be up in space by early 1958.
I promised the Secretary of the Army that we would be ready in 90 days or less. Let's go, Werner.
What happens at this point is they're told, let's go do it. They've already started building the satellite that they're going to use. And it's being hidden in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, in Pasadena. The Army's already started building the satellite that they wanted to put up in the first place, and the rocket. And so they do it in what appears to the world to be a miraculous amount of time. It just seems like possible they could go from 0 to 60 in that thing. And of course, what doesn't come out for years and only goes out little pieces is they were building this stuff just against the orders.
Then on January the 31st, in Cape Canaveral, Florida, Explorer goes into the history books as America's first satellite, launched from a Juno rocket.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Firing command. Firing command. Fuel tank pressurized. Block tank pressurized. Missile power. Ignition. Mainstay. Lift off. Lift off. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Some 3 minutes later, Explorer is in orbit, broadcasting to the world its coded scientific data. Cosmic ray intensity, meteor impact, solar radiation. These are the dry facts that will help carry man ever farther into the age of space.
With this important victory, the United States catches up to the Russians, as the name von Braun is etched in stone as America's space savior. With Explorer circling the Earth, a full-fledged race to the finish line has begun. Both superpowers stop at nothing in this game of one-upmanship. Missiles, once looked down upon by Eisenhower, go into mass production as the preferred weapon of choice, whether on land or sea, leading to the end of costly bomber projects like the B-70 Valkyrie. Then in 1958, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, is created, with Wernher von Braun put in charge of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, where he and his associates build the new Saturn rocket.
So help you God.
So help me God.
In January of 1961, President John F. Kennedy, a strong advocate for missile defense, is sworn into office. Less than 3 months later, on April the 12th, Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man to enter outer space, giving the Soviets yet another victory in the space race. This pivotal event causes Kennedy to make this one of his top priorities, pledging to send a man to the moon, a distance of 238,000 miles by the end of the decade. For an American public obsessed with space travel, catching up to their arch-rivals is no longer acceptable. They must beat their arch-rivals. The Cold War has never been any hotter. In the missile realm, the weapon Khrushchev believed would prove decisive makes its mark less than 2 years after the 35th president's inauguration, when the nation of Cuba, led by radical Marxist Fidel Castro, receives ballistic missiles from the Soviet Union, putting the entire Western world on the brink of nuclear annihilation. Located 90 miles from the coast of Florida, this important Soviet ally gives Khrushchev a beachhead he could only dream of less than a decade before.
To become a target for nuclear war
During the pivotal 1962 standoff, a deal is reached with both sides agreeing to remove missiles from their strategic outposts, ending one of the most tense moments in Cold War history. Following the assassination of President Kennedy, his commitment to space exploration continues through the next two administrations, culminating with the launch of Apollo 11 on July 16, 1969, as Neil Armstrong becomes the first man to set foot on the moon. For Wernher von Braun, his lifelong dream is finally realized after nearly a decade of obscurity in El Paso and Huntsville. With this great triumph, the space race, starting with the launching of Sputnik in October of 1957, is finally over. It is hard to imagine that an unmanned device weighing just over 180 pounds could set off a contest that would consume hundreds of billions of dollars. What becomes more startling is the fact that Sputnik, and all the fascination surrounding it, was Sergei Korolev's Plan B, a weapon that was not part of any grand Soviet vision, but merely a contingency plan, rushed together in a moment of panic. A launch designed to stroke Khrushchev's ego, and a device that was seen as secondary to the R-7. No one either in Moscow or Washington, D.C. could know that this satellite would change the direction of these two countries on a path that would prove to be irreversible.